The definition of what cinema is has changed throughout the history of the medium. What was considered cinema in the early days is a far cry from the summer blockbusters that are released today. But in some ways, early cinema had an advantage over modern cinema. Nowadays, people have very strict expectations of what a movie is, or what it should be, and don't like it being challenged. When Star Wars The Last Jedi released in theaters featuring a scene where all audio is suspended for a short sequence, some theaters had to put up signs reassuring the audience that the film wasn't malfunctioning, that the silence was part of the film. Because if an action movie isn't barraging the viewer with rapid-fire sound for 2 hours, then obviously it must be a technical issue. For whatever advances have been brought to cinema by the march of progress, early cinema is fascinating, and has always been fascinating to me, precisely because the filmmakers of that time had free reign to create, as they were not yet beholden to any rules or conventions of what constitutes a film. At that time, a film could be anything and everything. Tom Gunning wrote in Cinema of Attractions, "Early filmmakers have been studied primarily from the viewpoint of their contribution to film as a storytelling medium, particularly the evolution of narrative editing. Although such approaches are not totally misguided, they are one-sided and potentially distort both the work of these filmmakers and the actual forces shaping cinema before 1906. That's not to say that film isn't a storytelling medium, it is, but back in the early days, not every film followed the now basic formula, for better or worse. Nowadays, movies are expected to have narratives and characters. Even ones portraying real-life events insert characters and situations that didn't exist for the sake of crafting a better story. Patch Adams springs to mind, having created a love interest for the main character who never really existed, or other so-called historical dramas compositing characters together like in The Great Escape, compositing several real people into the characters depicted in the film, or how in Rudy, with the permission of the actual Dan Devine, who was unaware of how antagonistic the screenwriter planned on making him, turned the football coach into a villain when he was actually the one who insisted on dressing Rudy for the final game. Honestly, one of the things about studying film is that you learn to never fully trust anything you see put on a screen, because you know how easily the truth can be twisted and altered to suit a purportedly necessary narrative, and the idea of film becoming almost beholden to narrative elements would make an interesting video on its own, so I'll cut to the chase. This was summed up most succinctly by Jim Carrey as Andy Kaufman in Milos Forman's Man on the Moon.
All of the most important things in my life are changed around and mixed up for dramatic purposes.
Early cinema was unburdened by that necessity and had actualities that were just events filmed by a camera with no narrative to speak of, like workers leaving the Lumiere factory. I recently took a visit to the Museum of the Moving Image down in Queens, mainly for their Jim Henson exhibit, but I also took a second look at their Behind the Screen exhibit, which details the history of filmmaking, which was, in general, a great experience, and if you live in New York City or you're visiting Queens for any reason, and you have some time to kill between whatever it is you're there to do, I highly suggest visiting it. Full disclosure though, it's hidden in the middle of the block, so you might walk past it accidentally. I know I did. From that visit, I would postulate that early filmmakers were attempting to use their newfound medium to the fullest. The tools on display at the museum show that while they were working with, by today's standards, primitive tools, such as the early animation tools and kinetoscopes and, of course, early cameras, they were still crafting unique films and did a lot with what little they had, and they utilized every tool they had at their disposal to create unique and interesting films. Gunning writes of the cinema of attraction, which in his words is a cinema that bases itself on the quality that Lager celebrated, its ability to show something. And he takes note of how conventions have changed, especially through the formerly widespread act of simply acknowledging the camera's existence. This action, which is later perceived as spoiling the realistic illusion of the cinema, is here undertaken with brio, establishing contact with the audience. In today's cinema, such an act, unless it is meant to be part of the narrative, like in fourth wall breaking films like Ferris Bueller's Day Off, Deadpool, or any Mel Brooks films, mainly comedies, would be unthinkable. While a live performance inherently acknowledges the spectators, such as in pausing for applause or a reaction, films take place in a bubble that spectators are not allowed inside, and that change could be resultant from the shift of what type of art films are trying to be. Panofsky mentions the distinction between folk art and art, as such. As a rule, folk art derives from what is known as higher art. This on its own does not preclude experimentation, but it does create limits. It was soon realized that the imitation of a theater performance with a set stage, fixed entries and exits, and distinctly literary ambitions is the one thing the film must avoid. While this is far from definitive proof, it seems to be the start of constricting film into a box of what is and isn't acceptable to be considered art. Film must avoid the elements of theater, must take place in that bubble. The Museum of the Moving Image contains a lot of history on the development of film and the development of how not only the people making the films interacted with each other, the creation of various departments and sections of filmmaking, makeup, costuming, set design, etc., but also the development of how film interacted with its audience. With even the experience of seeing a film becoming a sort of ritual, divorced from the early days where one would see a film by standing and staring into a large box through eye holes, or by spinning a zooscope. And the farther that the audience got, the more everything became samey. I mean, to me it feels like every single movie trailer follows the same beats, even when one film is a high-octane action film and the other one is a biopic. Experimentation still exists in film today, I'm not disputing that, but on the whole, the major studios tend to gravitate to safer waters, whereas the pioneers of early cinema, including Louis Lumiere, were intrepid explorers heading for the rough waters ahead to see what they could truly do with their new medium, much like Lumiere depicted in his boat leaving the port. Early cinema was unique because there were no limits as to what it could be, while the state of cinema today is far from terrible, although, the Oscars was last week and despite the advances in technology, mainstream cinema isn't quite as experimental, as spontaneous as it was in the early days, when filmmakers were just throwing stuff at the wall to see what stuck. Indie film continues this trend to be sure, but it's very rarely seen in major releases. Early filmmakers were visionaries, and through the history of film, some of that vision has been lost because of the shift in what is and isn't considered cinema or art, and the introduction of rules and conventions for film. I mean, every screenwriting class uses the exact same basis for teaching, which is great to teach everyone how to write one type of movie, but it only teaches you how to write one type of movie. But I hope that one day soon, in the art of filmmaking, the sky will once again be the limit.